Westlake negates in our sole contentions Iran. Wainer 19 writes in October that failed efforts to ease U.S.-Iran tensions have left both sides hardening their positions with mistrust growing and a risk of escalation. The region appears to be gradually descending into confrontation, and Iran is the most dangerous theater in the world today. The U.S.-enabled proliferation of OCOs have set the Iranian situation on a path to disaster in 3 ways. First is firing the starting shot. In 2010, the world's conception of cyber war changed forever, as Greenberg 19 writes that a piece of malware dubbed Stuxnet, the most sophisticated piece of code ever engineered for a cyber attack, was accidentally discovered. Launched by the US with the intent to hamstring Iran's attempts to build a nuclear bomb, Stuxnet would become to recognize as the pistol shot that started the global cyber arms race. Slavin 15 writes that over the next 3 years, driven by Stuxnet, Iran decided that building national cyber capabilities was just the next natural step in its defense, and Iran's budget for cybersecurity since then has increased by 1,200%. Fazzini 19 continues that during the years after Stuxnet, despite economic odds stacked against them, Iran has become one of the world's most significant cybersecurity powers. Henning 19 elaborates that there was a rise in malicious cyber activity directed at U.S. industry by Iran, the latest move in a rapidly escalating cyber conflict. Second is teaching Tehran. OCOs are like DNA. Their source code can be stolen and repurposed. In fact, after the United States launched Stuxnet, MIMS 19 found that the code was able to be downloaded, studied, and reused. Problematically, this replicability allowed Iran to become a dominant and dangerous threat in cyberspace. Brunner 19 continues that Iran's development of its cyber capabilities stems from the fact that it had an excellent teacher named Stuxnet. Stuxnet taught Iran how to use cyberspace to its advantage and execute attacks of its own. Third is shattering norms. Valeriano 19 writes that for a variety of reasons, including the ineffectiveness of cyber operations, a normative system of restraint has gradually emerged in cyberspace. However, loosening the rules of engagement in pursuit of a more offensive posture, as the Trump administration advocates, violates norms and can lead to disastrous consequences for the entire system. The line is inching forward as Grohl 19 continues that the United States' eagerness to rely on digital weapons to strike back against Iran will be lowering the bar for engaging in a new domain of warfare, normalizing destructive attacks. Valeriano 19 continues that with this more offensive posture, it will be increasingly difficult for states to differentiate between espionage and more damaging degradation operations. This posture will lead great powers to assume all network intrusions are preparing the environment for offensive strikes, producing a forever cyber war prone to inadvertent escalation. Kennedy 19 concludes that Iran is less cognizant of red lines than other U.S. adversaries. For example, they launched a massive destructive malware attack on Saudi Aramco and targeted the U.S. financial sector. Iran is both aggressive and unpredictable and is willing to act boldly just to send a message. The impact is spillover. OCOs inherently have a wide degree of uncontrollability. Lin 12 writes that OCOs require detailed knowledge about access path to the targeted system, which is not easily available. This scarcity of intelligence regarding possible attacks means that any OCO launch can only be relatively indiscriminate attack, resulting in large uncertainties about the effects of an operation and collateral damage. Kennedy 19 continues that the chances are high that we will see an extended cyber conflict between the United States and Iran. Iran has shown itself to be one of the most aggressive actors in cyber warfare and hasn't shied away at attacking the United States. This mix of unpredictability means that cyber attacks can produce unexpected outcomes, triggering a dire event with major consequences. The same is for the U.S., as Rodner 17 continues that the United States cannot control its own creations and may inadvertently cause enormous collateral damage, hitting a lot of unintended targets. For example, Stuxnet did not die at Iran. Instead, it quickly spread, ultimately infecting over 100,000 computers in India, Indonesia, and elsewhere, demonstrating that OCOs are nearly impossible to control. The destructive potential of these incidents are unparalleled. Straub 19 writes that a cyber attack in one area that spreads can cause death rivaling the death toll of a nuclear weapon. He gives the example of hackers hijacking water treatment plants, shutting down major sections of the grid, blowing up petrochemical plants, shutting down oil and gas pipelines, and targeting nuclear energy facilities, all cyber Hiroshimas waiting to happen.
affirm resolve the benefits of the United States federal government's use of offensive cyber operations outweighs the harm. Contention 1 is NATO. Russian aggression is increasing. Emerson of the Financial Times reports in October of 2019 that Russian government-backed cyber aggression is heightening concerns from the West following a spate of high-profile incidents prompting threats of countermeasures from NATO. The NATO Secretary General declared that cyber threats to the security of NATO are becoming more frequent, more complex, and more destructive. Unfortunately, NATO cannot protect itself because it does not have a cyber command. Luckily, the U.S. can protect the alliance. As Tucker of Defense One reports in 2019, NATO is building a cyber command that is scheduled to be fully operational in 2023 and will coordinate and conduct all offensive cyber operations. However, until then, whatever NATO does offensively will rely heavily on the U.S. and the discretion of U.S. commanders. This is crucial, as Herzenhorn of Politico reports in 2019, with U.S. President Donald Trump raising previously unthinkable doubts about America's willingness to defend its traditional NATO allies, some European officials insist the continent must do more to defend itself. He continues, proposals for more robust European defense range from a series of initiatives, including the development of a full-blown EU army. Fortunately, Balder of AP writes in 2018 that committing to use offensive cyber operations for NATO allies is a way for the U.S. to show its continued commitment to NATO. This is critical, as it stops the EU from militarizing. Hiller of the Peace Science Digest in 2017 quantifies that a 1% increase in military spending will decrease a country's economic growth by 9%. Sanchez of the St. Louis Fed furthers in 2012 that a 1% decrease in GDP is associated with a near 2% increase in the unemployment rate. Problematically, Rolfs of Stony Brook University finds in 2011 that unemployment is associated with a 63% higher risk of mortality. Contention 2 is countering terrorism. Terrorists are inherently vulnerable. Price of the Harvard Belfer Center in 2012 finds that terrorist groups are susceptible to leadership decapitation because their organizational characteristics amplify the difficulties of leadership succession. The best way to remove terrorist leaders is through special operations. According to Johnston of Harvard in 2012, that is because decapitation efforts include attempts to remove leaders through assassination plots and raids, or sweeps of leaders' compound or camp areas. Fortunately, Smith of the New York Times in 2017 reports that the Trump administration is relying on special operation forces to continue its fight against terrorists. Offensive cyber operations enhance the effectiveness of special ops. As Tavito of the Naval Postgraduate School in 2016 finds that cyber operations build intelligence infrastructures without putting boots on the ground. This collection of information enables special op forces to conduct core activities from afar. For example, Rogers of the U.S. Cyber Command in 2018 explains that ISIS lost 98% of their territory in Iraq and Syria, enabling millions to begin to rebuild their cities and lives. Roger furthers that offensive cyber operations played a crucial role in this progress, with the U.S. Cyber Command supporting the successful offensive operation conducted by U.S. Special Ops. In fact, Haberman of the New York Times reports this week that Special Operation Forces were responsible for killing the leader of ISIS. Given that terrorist groups are vulnerable and inherently difficult to replace, Jordan of Georgia Tech in 2012 quantifies that decapitated organizations were 670% more likely to end than those that have not undergone decapitation. More generally, special ops have been effective. As Sofer from the Center for American Progress in 2012 explains with Al-Qaeda, that after the SEAL 6 team raid against bin Laden, there's been a 35% decrease in casualties from Al-Qaeda attacks, a 65% drop in successful attacks outside of Africa, and the number of successful attacks has decreased by 78%. In Israel, Feynman of Foreign Affairs in 2006 quantifies that targeted killings have shattered Palestinian terrorists, with the lethality of these groups dropping from 540% to 11%. This is crucial. As the UN in 2015 writes, the spread of violent extremism has further aggravated an already unprecedented humanitarian crisis which surpasses the boundaries of any one region. Millions of people have fled the territory controlled by terrorists and violent extremist groups. Save lives and affirm.
Let's talk about Al-Qaeda. What happened after we decapitated Al-Qaeda's leader?
I mean, I'm sure you're going to say
ISIS formed. So why would decapitating ISIS not form more groups?
So we would say that even if they do form, like another group forms, because we would say that like Al-Qaeda and ISIS used different methods and had like different motives, but we would say it's still on net better to have special ops there so they can then take out the other ride.
We killed ISIS, we created 3 new terrorist groups. What's worse, 1 terrorist group or 3?
Wait. So Al-Qaeda, you literally just said it only created 1.
It created ISIS, Al-Shabaab, other terrorist groups.
I mean, I'd say those terrorist groups are inherently really weak because they gather around
ISIS is weak. Hold up.
Like the reason they lost 98% of their territory.
They lost 98% of the territory, but the damage that they done before that was catastrophic. What's not to say that us decapitating ISIS again will create the same situation?
I mean, like, here's the problem. If they're in, like, your world, there's just, we're doing nothing to stop terrorism. Like, that's on net a bad thing.
Wait, me saying that I'm doing nothing to stop terrorism is not a justification to, like, not vote against this. If anything, you're worsening terrorism, right? Also, let's talk about strikes. Let's talk about strikes in general,
Sure,
okay?
sure.
So what happens whenever you kill the leader of a terrorist organization? How do civilians feel about that?
So I'm sure you're gonna tell me it increases anti-American sentiment, right?
Yep.
Okay, well, we would tell you that anti-American sentiment, the root cause comes from civilian casualties. That's the way we see terrorist groups actually recruiting. They go up to people and say, look, this is what the West did to your children, that you need to join our group. But
Okay,
what we
do
specifically
terrorist leaders
say,
have
can I
families?
finish? What we specifically say is
Sure.
that special operations reduce that incentive because they, like, minimize casualties. They minimize casualties in comparison to other
Actually, let's talk about your
mechanisms.
casualties evidence.
Sure.
So you say that we saw a 670% decrease in the probability that the terrorist group rose up again as a result of decapitation operations. What does that study look at? What terrorist group?
We'd say it
Looks at Al-Qaeda. It looks at Al-Qaeda. Why? ISIS, Al-Qaeda was completely fractured even before it was like formed, right? There was multiple different groups within Al-Qaeda. ISIS only has one group. So is that study applicable to ISIS?
Yes, we would tell you it's a holistic analysis.
There's all causes. Like, how are you addressing those all causes?
What other alt causes?
Al-Qaeda was fractured, ISIS isn't.
ISIS literally has lost 98% of their territory.
You repeating your statistics is not answering my all
causes.
causes, but we've been on this issue for a while.
Sure. So let's talk about what happened with Stuxnet, specifically like the 100,000 computers. What was the
Sure.
impact of that?
Shut down a lot of banks. Can I have a question?
Wait, what's the impact of that?
People
like, if you
died.
just tell me how many. Because, like,
Okay,
this
quantify.
happened in the past. You should be able to tell me what actually happened.
Us waiting for the future since the magnitude
No,
is
no,
so.
I'm
Wait,
asking for your
I'm
past
answering your
experience.
question. Right now, Iran is trying to hack into U.S. dams. Us waiting for that attack to actually like
I
go
understand
through
your
is not.
argument. I'm asking you about your empiric.
I told you my empiric. They're trying to attack dams. Can I have a question?
Sure.
Cool. So let's talk about your argument about like the CO rates, right? You say CO rates decrease like the number of deaths by 35%. Did we use OCOs with the CO rates?
We would say that it makes them better.
We didn't.
We've been using them since 2000.
We didn't use OCOs with the CO rates.
Actually, could I see a piece of evidence? Just the 670% decrease.
Sure. Just saying, power right here.
Alright, stop right. 1 second. Actually, stop right. 42 seconds taken. Okay. So it'll start at the top of their case, and then I'll read an underview when I get to the bottom, as well as some weighing.
I'll give you an article.
Yeah. Is there anyone not ready? Start at their first contention. Right now, they already tell you that they're building these cyber capabilities, which proves that they're already militarizing. Even if it's by 2023, it proves that they're not feeling secure with the current existing offensive cyber operations, which means they're already failing. However, you turn this contention because Greenberg finds that the root cause of the global cyber arms race was because the US used Stuxnet, which triggered everybody else to escalate. The implication is twofold. The first is that nobody would have cared about Stuxnet or the cyber operations had we never used them. But the second is that we're accelerating the global cyber arms race, which is what leading to so many destabilizing effects. It's what leading to people increase their spending on militarization in the first place. They turn themselves. But the second response response comes from Vavra, which explains that the UK, the Netherlands, and 8 other countries already have access to offensive cyber operations. It's not unique to just the US. They need to internalize how much the US uniquely increases it insofar as any country having access to it to means that they all have defensive capabilities. That means that they don't have an impact. But even the topic tells us to talk about offensive cyber capabilities, not defensive cyber capabilities, is not even topical. But next, Foreign Affairs finds that in 2016, when Russia was about to attack us, what happened was NATO became even stronger because all the countries rallied together. The implication is that if Russia were to try to attack us again, first, it'd be really bad to do it because they're not positioned very well. But second, were they to do it, the relationship would strengthen and everybody would come together. But now let's go down to the impact. The impact chart is really bad because first, it talks about a 20-year period. It's not very clear. But second, it's not even manifested before insofar as they're building the cyber capabilities right now. We haven't seen any increase. But now let's go down to the second engine. Nick at the very top finds that the decapitation methods are not really good. He turns them in by finding that they actually incentivize terrorist groups to use them to recruit other terrorists, which means that they're on net increasing their forces. But second is a turn from Valeriano, which says that Trump's new strategy is less of the espionage and more of the offensive capabilities. That means they're not actually getting the strike needed to decapitate, they're just hacking the systems, they're not being very effective. But let's talk about efficacy, right? Because when I call for the evidence about 670%, it says it's not effective against already established organizations such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and organizations that already exist, which means that they're not going to be effective against the terrorist groups that are causing the most harm. But let's talk about ISIS in particular, because Wu says that they still have tens of thousands of soldiers, they still done 250 attacks, and Kurdistan 24 includes that they're actually increasing the amount of attacks in the status quo. The implication is that if they didn't even decrease ISIS in the first place, the land that was lost due to other reasons. As Belden explains, that the Kurds, UK, France, Arab nation, and all the other nations work together to decrease the influence of ISIS, which means that we always have alternative reasons to decrease them. In fact, as we continue, Perez explains that the US put $2.8 trillion in fighting ISIS. The implication is that had we not had offensive cyber operations, we would have decreased them in other ways, which means that they need to tell you the degree of efficacy that OCOs provided in order to access a degree of impact. However, at the very bottom, Fry explains that right now, what they cause is the Hydra effect. When they decrease the ability of one cyber operation, one terrorist organization to operate, they increase the rise of others. This is for 4 reasons. The first is that Greenberg explains they can use our own terrorist groups to use their own technology, such as Stuxnet. And Fronte explains that what they can do is they can use cyber capabilities to spoof terrorist networks, they can spoof nuclear networks, and they can cause a nuclear miscalculation. But what they do is they send a non-nuclear missile, and then they make systems believe that it's nuclear, which increases the chance of nuclear terrorism. The second reason that they increase terrorism is because Grohl explains that Stuxnet established cyber terrorism as the alternative, and that's why they're increasing the arms race right now. As Graham explains, this is far worse because now these groups have a far higher capability to cause much more harm than they did in the past. The third reason is because of cyber proxies. Gruner explains that what's right now, after Iran got their capability through offensive cyber operations, they immediately began giving it to other actors in the region called cyber proxies, who are currently destabilizing the Middle East. They're causing a war with Saudi Arabia, and they're increasing instability. But the fourth reason is Abdullah, which explains that right now, Iran is using its own cyber capabilities to attack Saudi Arabia and attack Saudi Aramco, which is increasing instability. The reason why this outweighs their entire case is for 3 reasons. The first is a prereq, because when they create more groups through the increase of fragmentation and the increase in the ability to do damage, that means more overall damage done. But the second is on severity, because cyber capabilities give these groups the ability to do far more harm than they would without them. And the third is on scope, because we affect a large amount of cyber groups, not just the ISIS. However, go down to our case. We prereq their entire case, because Caliber 13 finds that something the equivalent of a nuclear strike would cause 2 billion deaths, which would drastically increase destabilization, it would drastically increase the amount of terrorist groups, and drastically increase the amount of harms. Remember, we weigh magnitude over probability, because Stuart explains that we have a lot of cognitive biases against high magnitude but low probability impacts. Therefore, we must inherently prioritize magnitude above probability, which means that we must win this round.
MC ISIS is gaining power in the okay.
I have multiple credits. I want to show you one.
Just whenever says they're gaining power right now. Also, was that speed fine for all the judges? I'll take more. Yeah. everybody ready? All right. So it's going to start responding to case, and then I'll front line. Just make sure I can see this.
May you respond to our case first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Start off on Iran. Before we get into the specific warrants, they need to prove that Iran is escalating right now. The only instance that they give you is 2012 when we used Stuxnet and Iran responded in suit. But we'll get to why Stuxnet didn't work. But moreover, you're going to want to buy that Iran is not causing problems right now insofar as they give you no empirics of an attack actually working outside of literally 7 years ago. But moreover, move on to their force warrant where they tell you that that was the starting shot of everything going bad, where they explicitly tell you that Stuxnet was the cause of all these problems. You can turn it because Mando of the National Interest finds in 2013 that the United States moved forward with Stuxnet because it was a safer alternative to a conventional strike, which means that the alternative was much worse than what we actually saw. This is corroborated by Smead 18, who finds that the usage of things like Stuxnet more often reduces the human cost of war and the chances that conflict happens. So even if Stuxnet was the shot of an arms race, it at the very least wasn't the shot of a conventional war that would have killed more people than Stuxnet actually ended up doing. But moreover, you're preferring us on recency, as Lawson 19 explains that the US launched a cyber attack against Iran a week ago, but in response to September attacks on Saudi oil facilities. Those OCOs had the benefit of providing response operations short of armed conflict, which can help de-escalate deadly militarized disputes. This has two implications. First is that it delinks their case, as US OCOs clearly don't cause escalation as of 5 days or as of 7 days ago. You're preferring us on recency, whereas Stuxnet was in a different geopolitical landscape. But it also turns them, as US OCOs, moreover, provide response options short of armed conflict, which makes a war a lot less likely. Remember, even if all of their impacts manifest at the end of the round, it's still better than a conventional war, which we tell you would kill millions. But onto their second warrant, where they talk to you about those terrorists being able to repurpose arms and use them for malevolent purposes. There are three problems. The first is that what we would say is that absent US OCOs, these people are still able to get those OCOs from other nations, specifically Russia and China are constantly attacking other nations. They can always get it from them. Second is that they don't prove that even if they get the US arm, or if they get the US OCO code, that they have the infrastructure to use it. What we would say is that the US has a lot of infrastructure specifically built up through the Department of Defense and the NSA. What that means is that we operate things very differently than they do. It's not true that a terrorist organization operating off of a handful of computers can do what the US can do with their $1 trillion military spending budget. But then, what we would say is that they tell you themselves that the process to repurpose offensive cyber operations takes time because they have to download the code and repurpose it for their own uses. What we would say is that the cyber landscape is constantly shifting, and during that time frame, things evolve, which is why they don't give you any terminalized impact coming off of repurposing. What we would say is that it can't happen because it takes too long for it to actually be effective. But then, they tell you that norms are shattered by the US, but there are a couple of problems. First is that they give absolutely no contextualization as to what these norms are, and what we would say is that there is a maxing out point as to what things can actually happen. Brown 11 explains that any cyber attack that is large enough to cause harm is detectable as it takes place for a longer time on a larger scale. What that means is that countries are always going to prefer using smaller attacks to keep themselves anonymous and safer, as they always have. The implication of this is that an arms race inevitably reaches a maximum as disincentives exist for nations conducting more harmful attacks. Because nations don't want to make themselves vulnerable by conducting long attacks, they're always going to do shorter ones, which means that the norm setting has a maxing out point where the norms can't get any more harmful because nobody's going to want to escalate further. But then, onto the impact. They really give you two. And the first is the idea that Stuxnet itself had a big problem. The problem comes from Mando of the National Interest, who writes in 2013 that the Stuxnet swarm did not cause damage because it was engineered specifically to set off the Iranian enrichment facilities only. This delinks the idea that Stuxnet was directly responsible for taking thousands of computers offline, but moreover, they don't terminalize what that actually meant other than just taking computers offline. They don't give you the human impact. But then, on their second impact about attacking the US grid, there are two problems. The first is Pereira 14 explains that because the US grid is spread out and highly developed, a literal squirrel could do more damage than any foreign nation could to the American grid. But moreover, no nation is ever going to want to attack us because American 16 explains that because of economic interdependence, cyber deterrence on behalf of the United States, and the diversity of our control systems, no nation is ever going to risk an attack on us. But with that said, let's move on to the responses. Start off by frontlining the Greenberg turn in our first contention. We're explicitly going to tell you that Stuxnet was not the cause of the arms race, insofar as we tell you that what's happening in NATO right now isn't an arms race. Russia is bullying around NATO in the absence of US OCOs, and the only way that we can solve for that conventional buildup on behalf of NATO is by having US OCOs to reassure them. That's Balder. But then, on the Valeriano turn, they say that right now we're just using hacking, but Schmidt and Rogers are very explicit when they say that right now we're not only using hacking, we're using them in conjuncture with OCOs to make special operations better. You start saying that like 4 seconds before.
Where's Scott? Okay.
So let's discuss the nature of cultural advice. Yeah. So we agree that historically, how norms have worked in the realm of the cyber warfare, it's been that people don't really want to escalate because they're scared of the consequences, right? That's what you tell me, right?
What we say specifically from Brown 11 is that people sure, they're fine with doing smaller cyber attacks, but when it comes to launching larger ones, those larger ones can never escalate to that point because they're scared of the
There was a norm of restraint and hesitation to escalate that was previously created by the fact that there was a lot of unpredictability surrounding OCOs, right?
No. So we tell you the reason that those norms of restraint exist, even when you affirm and continue the use of OCOs, is because it's not that they're unpredictable and we're not sure what they are yet. It's that literally launching a larger cyber attack takes more time. Can I finish really quick?
OCOs are unpredictable?
I finish really quick. During that time frame that a larger attack is launched, that leaves the country that launched that attack more vulnerable. That's what you concede with your second
Wait,
point.
so OCOs make a country more vulnerable by launching them?
No. What we're saying explicitly is that the larger OCOs that you say are more harmful, specifically things that set off things like Stuxnet and going beyond that into the future, are what we say aren't inherently good. That's why the OCOs that the US is using empirically thus far, specifically with special... Let me finish.
Essentially your warrant is that they're not good in the past, so they're not good in the future, right?
No, what we're saying is that in the past, you give no negative implication of that happening, and we say that the natural deterrence exists for escalation
all we
to
need
not
to
happen in the
disprove
future.
this is to say there was a natural, or there was something that showed that the other ways were true, right? Like the norms got destroyed, right?
Well, in order to have an impact, you need terminalization, but what we're going to say is that, you need to prove that increasing OCOs follows an increase in, norm setting and suit.
Okay, sure, you can have a question.
All right, sure. So why don't we talk? Yeah, you guys, we're good. All right, so why don't we talk specifically about what's happening with Iran? So when those
Which
Stuxnet.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So when we had Stuxnet, take off those, as you say, 1,000 computers throughout countries outside of Iran, spillover.
Yep.
What was the terminal impact?
Okay, so there's no impact that we're trying to garner off of shutting down 100,000 computers, right? That's why we don't terminalize it. The point of putting that in our case was to establish that the nature of offensive cyber operations are that they are incredibly unpredictable. That's the point of why we're linking to this spillover
the
impact.
problem is that
Can
if
I
they're
talk about my impact now?
Really quick,
Let's
if
talk
the
about-
reason that they're unpredictable is because they can lead to things like setting down 100,000 computers, but you only give me one example of unpredictability, and it wasn't even
Do you
bad,
want me to give you a second example?
just anything that had a terminal impact.
Wait,
We've been
that's
using
what the-
OCOs
wait,
for
that's
years
what the
now,
Straub
and there
evidence
is no...
says. That's what the Straub evidence says, okay? The Straub evidence says that there are a ton of critical infrastructure that be attacked, not just grids.
No, that's
because when you
specific
go
to the US.
when
That's
you
your
go
second
I know,
tangent of the
but when
impact.
you go up in rebuttal and you read impact defense about grids, I am more than willing to concede it, right? But Straub lists a ton of other critical infrastructure that could be devastated by cyber attacks, such as nuclear power plants.
But the
such
second response combats that by saying that grid infrastructure or general American infrastructure, those deterrents exist to prevent countries from doing that. Economic interdependence doesn't just exist
Okay, so
with the
then
grid.
why did Iran attack one of our dams just a few months ago?
Attack one of our dams, you don't say that that had any negative impact. There are smaller
Well, yes,
attacks that happen
because
all the
it didn't
time.
happen.
But you're
No,
specifically
because
saying that OCOs lead to
the
larger,
reason
more
why it
harmful
didn't
ones, but you haven't
the
listed
reason why it
something
didn't lead to an
harmful.
impact was because it wasn't successful. But let's not wait until it becomes successful
So
before we
nobody's ever
say
going
that
to
it's
attack
too
us
late.
successfully.
Wait, it'll be too late by then.
It's going to be starting with the underview on their case, then telling you why we link into it. Is anybody not ready? On their case, they concede Stewart. Stewart makes the analysis that we cannot evaluate probability because probability is subject to selection bias. Think about it like this. If I'm living in India or Pakistan, I think that the probability of nuclear war is way higher than somebody who lives in the United States. Insofar as this is true, you evaluate the random magnitude. We link into magnitude better than them in 3 key ways. Let's look to our case. First of all, is on our first contention about Iran. He tries to tell you that there's no escalation, there's no empirics of escalation. No, the Hennigan evidence tells you that recently, just 1 month ago, Iran increased their attacks on the U.S. financial sector. Clearly, there is empirics. But then, let's look at his responses to our link level. He just reads a big DA or a big advantage about how it prevents kinetic escalation. But what Grohl tells you is that as we continue cyber escalation, it's only going to decrease the line for more escalatory of attacks in the future, which means you do the long-term wing. Yes, sure, they're switching off to conventional warfare in the status quo, but what we argue is with more cyber escalation, that line's only going to decrease in the long term. But even then, foreign policy gives you 2 disincentives for kinetic warfare for the United States. A, there's an economic disincentive because it would spike oil prices, but B, there's a political disincentive. They're never actually going to start a kinetic conflict. Don't let them gain office off of this. But then, whenever you go toward link chain, we give you Greenberg, who says that the United States literally started the Stuxnet cyber arms race, which is why Slavin tells you that Iran increases their budget by 1,200% after Stuxnet. Overall, Hennigan concludes that Iran's more willing to do strikes in the status quo. Let's go to our second link. They try to say that they can still get capabilities to OCOs without the United States. Greenberg frontlines this and says that the Stuxnet was the starting shot. All the following OCOs that gave Iran those capabilities came from Stuxnet. But the second response they read is that they don't have the infrastructure. No, empirics disprove. We see that Iran is increasing their budget by 1,200%. Clearly, they do have the infrastructure. But then let's go to our impact. They try to say that they, generally there's deterrence and the cyber realm. But what's really important is that our impact is not about grids. It's about other things like petrochemical plants. And also there's no deterrence insofar as Iran's increasing their attacks on critical dams. That's where you can extend the Strauss evidence. So it says that we'd be able to, it would inevitably spill over because there's a lack of information on attacks, which would kill 2 billion people. That outweighs them on magnitude because they can never nearly outweigh that impact. But then let's go to the first contention about NATO. They can see the foreign affairs terminal defense on the first contention, which says that NATO will always become stronger in the case of a Russian attack. We will always be able to group together and stop the NATO influence. It's never going to have any material impact. NATO always is going to remain strong if Russia is preparing for an attack. But then let's go to their second contention. They drop 2 terms which outweigh them on magnitude. First is Greenberg, who says that terrorists can literally use the technology from U.S. OCOs to spoof nuclear weapons, which would cause a nuclear miscalculation. Franz tells you that it would inevitably cause nuclear war because they would make another state think that nuclear weapons being launched at them, which would cause the state to do a preemptive strike. Overall, that causes extinction. That outweighs them all their impacts because Starr tells you that even the consequences of a small nuclear war would cause extinction. It links into magnitude over probability. But then they also drop the agreement evidence that says that Iran's using cyber proxies from the United States to spur up conflict in the Middle East. What we tell you is that this conflict could inevitably affect the lives of millions of people. That's another way we outweigh them on magnitude. There are 3 links into magnitude. They can see magnitude over probability way. Don't let them try to kick out of it in 5-second summary.
let's start on the underview that he begins the summary with. First, he says that we need to prefer like magnitude over probability because of selection bias. But we say it's empirically bad to do this because look to policymakers. What they focus on is what's most probable along with magnitude. We have to be weighing both equally because at the end of the day, they both have an important role. But specifically, here's why we link in. First, on our first contention about NATO, they extend this thing about Tucker that says like NATO already has defense and that's why it's okay. But the problem is Tucker specifically says that the NATO Cyber Command is for offensive cyber operations, not defensive. That's where we link in. But specifically, they try to turn this by saying NATO gets stronger when Russia hacks them. But the problem is, Emerson finds right now that even though NATO is united and Russia is attacking them, the problem is they don't have the capabilities to attack them because they aren't conducting offensive cyber operations. That's where Herzengorg comes in because he tells us that Trump would join them and allow them for this offensive cyber command to be built. But the reason why that's so critical is because Balder tells us that offensive cyber operations when the US joins NATO is a sign of commitment. The reason that's critical is because military spending is bad. Hiller tells us that a 1% increase in military spending decreases GDP by 9%, and Sanchez tells us that a 1% decrease in GDP increases unemployment by 2%, and Roth tells us that unemployment leads to a 63% higher risk of mortality. The reason why that outweighs is threefold. And first, it's a prerequisite. If NATO can work together, then that deters other countries from actually attacking us. But moreover, we would say it actually improves our technologies to make them less likely to spill over. But then second, on clarity, all of their impacts are just saying spillover is going to happen, and in the past we've seen a bunch of attacks, but they don't terminalize what this means, what the impact has been, and what these spillovers are. If they can't even prove that has happened in the past, then you shouldn't vote them because we've been affirming for like 4 years. But then third, it's on probability. Remember, they say that countries can already attack us, but empirically we tell you that only small attacks happen because of the deterrence effect. But then, go on to their second contention about terrorism. They keep extending deterrence, but we're going to concede the dealing from Paris where they say that the US spends $2.5 billion fighting terrorism, regardless the deterrents are non-unique. Then, let's go on to their case. On their first contention about Iran, they basically say from Bull that in the long term, it's better to have cyber because in the long term, it's worse to have cyber because it risks escalation. But the problem is, Mando 19 precludes that because if conventional capabilities happen, then that means a war happens. If war happens, then millions die, and you can't even use prevent the cyber escalation in the long term because already millions of people have died. But then second, we would tell you from Lawson 18 that with the recent Iran attack, we actually saw no escalation. They say it's because they're never going to attack like conventionally because of oil, but that concedes the impact of deterrence. But more specifically, here's why more specifically, when they say that other countries can when they say Iran can get capabilities from the US, they ignore the response where we say that they get from Russia and China. They just say that Stuxnet with these shard and shot. Sure. But even so, if that didn't happen, they would have still gotten it from other countries such as Russia or China. But the reason why you don't value their impact at the end of the round is really clear. And that's Brown 18, who tells us that countries prefer using small attacks rather than large attacks because large attacks are easily detectable. The reason why that's crucial is because their impacts are never actually going to manifest. Spillovers don't happen from small attacks, they happen from large attacks, which are never going to happen.
Okay. So, what's the warrant for why the judges should act as policymakers?
Or specifically preferring probability over magnitude.
Sure.
So what we would say is that in order to make debate as educational of an activity as possible, we should be looking to impacts that have some non-zero probability of happening, and the higher the
So are we really
the
gonna
more
evaluate-
likely in the
So
real
why
world these
why
things
wasn't
will
this
happen.
analysis in summary?
Because that's a weighing overview, and rebuttal doesn't have any specific obligation to respond.
Wait,
to
but
weighing.
why wasn't this in second summary then? Why wasn't this warranting about why we should evaluate as policymakers in summary?
It
Because
wasn't summary.
this warranting
You
is
just
now,
said we should be policymakers
was
without
in-
a warrant.
Oh, you asked me specifically for the warrant, but we're telling you that.
But did you have a warrant in
but
summary?
was there a warrant in
Yeah.
summary?
The warrant has to.
Okay, fine. That's
Like,
fine.
that's
That's
kind
no
of just the
contest.
internal
Y'all
thing.
can have a question. Y'all can have.
Sure. So let's talk about the impact of spillovers. Have we seen anything happen?
Okay, first of all, insofar as magnitude or probability, you don't interact with the warranting, even if we haven't seen the impact yet, the magnitude justifies. But B, we would say, wait, hold up.
Have we seen it in the past?
Again,
Not,
we cannot show you that it's happened in the past. It hasn't happened yet. Our argument is that since tensions are so high, us waiting is not a solution.
Okay. We both agree it hasn't happened in the past. Do you have a question?
Well, if it happened in the past, I
It
feel
has
like-
not happened.
I know.
I
if
know
it
that
happened
is
in
not
the past,
justification to not vote neg. We
Right,
should
right.
just
That's
wait
just-
That's
it's
just
just
your
a
weighing, that was
clarification
just clarification on that.
That
you
we're
know.
trying to make sure.
Wait, if it
that-
happened in the
that's
past, we
clear.
wouldn't be alive.
Yeah.
Just making sure.
Y'all-
Sure.
It'll be important later. All right.
Okay.
We asked that question.
All right, perfect. So y'all can take another question.
Okay. Amazing.
Sure. So why don't we talk specifically about NATO?
Yeah, sure.
So, at the end of the day, you only say that NATO is grouping up right now, but is NATO
That's not
grouping
what
up
we
with
say.
those 8 nations that you talked
No,
about?
so you say,
Well, can I ask the question on that specifically?
you just asked me a question. I'm
I
answering
didn't
your
finish
question.
it. You cut me
Okay,
off before
yeah,
I did.
go ahead.
So with that specifically, were those defensive or offensive operations?
That's not the response that we made.
That is the response.
No, I
said
think you
that NATO is
misquoted
grouping
because
up in a
the
group of
response
8
that we
nations.
made, the internal link into your scenario triggering, which is that increases military spending, is that with absent OCOs, like basically the alliance becomes weaker, correct?
No, it's just that they feel the threat of Russia.
Yeah, so the alliance becomes weaker without US OCOs, correct?
It becomes weaker specifically from the cyber standpoint.
Okay,
but nothing
specific from the cyberspace, right? Our argument, which you don't interact with through foreign affairs, says that even absent OCOs, whenever Russia is building up their capabilities, all the countries part of NATO inevitably come together and they like get rid of those like mistrust in the alliance,
That's great,
right?
but they literally don't have the capability to do so because cyber command does not exist.
Wait, again, that is not what we're arguing, right? We would say that like, first of all, cyber command is one of like many factors that influence NATO, but also we would still say that they're way more likely to cooperate and decrease that mistrust whenever Russia's building up their weapons. That's the internal defense you draw.
Our impact isn't about
Y'all can take the
mistrust, it's
question.
about European
Wait, your internal link into prolif is
I'm
mistrust.
just gonna ask a question. What's your warrant, like, internal link into why we prefer magnitude? Like, you just say selection bias. You
Yep,
don't say
if I'm in
that-
India and I like think that there's like a nuclear, I probably think the probability of nuclear war is higher.
So we should probably look to objective and
Are you trying to answering my
Because
warranting right
probability
process?
is
Not like
subjective,
this.
we should look to magnitude, which isn't. Anyways, we'll take the remainder of our program. We'll start with the underview, and then I'll respond to their weighing mechanisms, and then I'll go down to their case and then back to my case. Is there anyone not ready?
Start with the underview. They just say we should look to empirics when we look like a policymaker. First, they don't tell you why we should look at a policymaker. Second, they don't even give you a warrant on why it's important. And third, it comes in a second summary, don't evaluate it. Instead, evaluate straw, which explains that because of selection biases, probability is inherently subjective. That's why we should look to magnitude, which is not. Now that means that we link it to straw, which explains that it would the spillover would cause the deaths equivalent to a nuclear war. That means that we get rid of their clarity wing. Now they just say that deterrence solves. But here's the thing, it hasn't deterred Iran, which is striking us right now, and it hasn't deterred terrorist groups, as Brenda explains, are inherently nihilistic, they don't care about man. Next, they say that the probability is small. But not only is this toward the extent the response is, but Hennigan explains that attacks are happening right now, the probability is not small. Now let's go down to NATO. Let's first extend the Greenberg term, which explains that we started the threat in the first place with Stuxnet, which caused Russia and China to militarize in the first place. That's what causes NATO to be so scared of these capabilities. But second, extend foreign associations, which explains that right now we're deterring them. Whenever they start to increase their attacks, we come together and we solve for it. However, we pre-react their entire case because first, extinction means that NATO obviously doesn't exist. But second, on magnitude, because their terminalized impact is just the loss of jobs, while our terminalized impact is 2 billion deaths, which means that we're causing an irreversible impact, while they can just be solved by economic growth. But now let's go back down to our case on the very top. First, they say that they haven't attacked, but Hennigan explains that they have been attacking and the rate at which they attack is increasing. Next, they say that it's never happened, but Straub explains that the risk of it happening would cause the equivalent of a nuclear strike. Next, they say that they concede our foreign policy about the oil thing, but the really big problem with it is that we're just saying that a conventional war is not going to happen, they don't get their turn. Next, they say that they still get the capability, but Greenberg explains it was uniquely Stuxnet which taught them how to do it, and Hennigan explains that they developed their capabilities by 1,200%. Last is their Brown defense, which says that Iran is the Brown defense, which says that deterrence solves. But Kennedy explains that Iran is unpredictable. That's why we've been attacking indiscriminately. And Straub explains this has caused spills over, which destroys important infrastructure, which causes 2 billion deaths. But on their case, on the terrorism turn, it's really important. They just concede defense about 2.5 trillion, but they concede the offense from Greenberg, which explains that it's better to use our technology instead. And what Front explains is this allows them to spoof nuclear detection things and increase the chance of nuclear war. As Starr explains, this would even a small nuclear war would cause catastrophic destruction that would cause extinction. They conceded this turn, and in second summary, they can see some defense that's completely unrelatable. Essentially, what's happening right now is it's extended offense through, which means that we have a link into extinction, and we have a link into winning this round because extinction prereqs all of their offense.
Is everybody ready? So it's going to start with the underview debacle, then NATO, then terrorists. Start off on the underview. Remember, we tell you that high probability impacts are the most important because we are playing the roles of policymakers, and policymakers look at probability. That's weighing. It's allowed to come whenever the round it wants, and it was in summary. But moreover, they say that probability is subjective. So let's look to the empirics. There are two specific reasons that they have zero probability in today's round. First is that they give you no terminalized impact. They just give you vague definitions of attacks that don't mean the bright line that they tell you is the most important in the round. They have zero probability, meaning that we shouldn't evaluate them at all. But the second reason that they don't have probability is that they drop the Brown D-link, who finds that because countries aren't going to want to do larger attacks because they put themselves at a vulnerable state, we see that there's going to be no negative impact coming off of these massive power failures because those attacks are never going to happen, which is why the loss in evidence literally concludes that we've been doing attacks as of 7 days ago and have seen no negative impact. That outweighs on recency and probability because they have zero. But then, the reason you're voting for us is off of NATO. We explicitly tell you from Imison that right now Russian aggression is increasing, and as such, NATO is building up their military to combat it. We provide solvency, as Tucker finds that right now NATO is building a cyber command but needs US offensive cyber operations to finish it. They just tell you that this fear comes from Stuxnet in the first place, but that's non-responsive to the argument. We're explicitly telling you from Imison that right now Russia is launching campaigns against NATO, specifically trying to bully them around. That has nothing to do with Stuxnet and offensive cyber operations on that front. We're explicitly telling you that Russia is exerting their geopolitical influence over NATO, which is why Balder finds that the US is using their cyber operations to help NATO. It's more of a perceptual fear quelling. But then they tell you that right now the EU is squatting up and that they're having this ability to stop these cyber attacks from happening. But that is defensive. We explicitly tell you that offensive cyber operations are what prevent negative things from happening in the first place. That's our uniqueness. The reason it's problematic comes from Hiller, Sanchez, and Rolfs, who find that a 1% increase in military spending decreases GDP by 9%, which increases unemployment, and unemployment has a 63% increase in mortality. We outweigh on the prereq analysis that they drop, insofar as NATO deters conflict from happening in the first place, and solves back for any lapses in American offensive cyber operations by increasing their efficacy and increasing us working with other nations. We solve back for everything. Really quickly on their case, they drop the trade-off with conventional warfare, where we find that in the absence of any offensive cyber operations, conventional warfare is used. That outweighs first on magnitude. That would kill literally millions of people. Second is clarity. They don't give you any example of what's actually happening. And third is on time frame. Those conflicts are just as prone to escalation as any type of Stuxnet, and we show you that those have happened in the past, and they'll be worse when they do in the future.